The first shot cracked the morning stillness of Whispering Creek Ranch, and Thomas Rawlins froze with a bridle still in his hand. The sky was barely flushed with dawn, yet a woman stood at the eastern fence line, motionless, her face painted with streaks of war markings that the sunrise turned into flames. She did not flinch at the echo of gunfire that split the silence. She simply stared at him, her dark eyes steady, her hand resting on a leather pouch pressed against her hip. Thomas's pulse hammered. The ranch was empty of men, no riders, no hired hands. Only him and the horses. He had risen early to muck the stalls, not to stare down a stranger draped in shadows of danger. The earth around her bore the proof of others' footprints circling, too many to belong to one traveler. He knew then that this was no accident. She had been sent here, alone but not alone, at the weakest hour of his day. Whether she came as messenger, spy, or lure, Thomas could not yet tell. But the certainty struck him as hard as the gunshot had. His father's unfinished war with the railroads had just arrived at his own doorstep. The Sangre de Cristo Mountains loomed in the distance, their ridges painted violet by the rising sun. Whispering Creek Ranch stretched in the valley below, a patch of stubborn life clinging to an unforgiving land. The air smelled of wet earth and wood smoke, touched by the musk of horses and the sharp resin of pine drifting down from the slopes. Every sound carried farther in the stillness, hooves shifting in stalls, the distant cry of a hawk, the hiss of creek water tumbling over stone. Thomas Rawlins tightened his grip on the bridle, forcing himself to breathe. The woman remained by the fence, her posture unyielding, as if carved from the land itself. She wore deerskin leggings that had seen dust in battle, a fringed tunic bound at the waist with a strip of rawhide. Across her chest hung a small bone charm, polished by years of touch. But it was her eyes that caught him, dark, luminous, filled with the kind of silence that carried both sorrow and defiance. She said her name once, almost like a warning. Nayeli. Thomas knew better than to let curiosity dull caution. At 35, he had learned to weigh every stranger against the ledger of risk. The ranch was his inheritance and his burden, left to him after his father Edward Rawlins's sudden death. Folks in town still whispered about the old man's dealings with the railroad, about papers gone missing, about promises never kept. Thomas rarely answered those whispers. He carried them instead like stones in his pockets, heavy enough without explanation. He was not a man, easily swayed. His face bore the hardness of sun and solitude. Square jaw rough with a week's beard, gray eyes shadowed from years of suspicion. He had grown into his father's shoulders but never his ease. Something in him always braced for the next betrayal. Even now, with the dawn still fresh, he felt that familiar edge sharpen. Nayeli shifted slightly, drawing his attention back to the pouch clutched against her hip. The gesture was small, but it spoke volumes. Whatever she carried was more important than her own safety. Thomas noticed the faint tremor in her fingers before she stilled them, the way a warrior forces her body to obey when her heart falters. She was young, perhaps no more than 22, yet her presence suggested someone older, hardened by trials he could only guess at. The land around them was a battlefield disguised as beauty. Streams cut through dry grass that could wither by midsummer. Cattle grazed in thin lines across the far pasture, their silhouettes fragile against the horizon. This was a place where survival was never guaranteed, where every man, woman, or child carried the shadow of hunger, storm, or bullet. Thomas knew it well. He had buried too many good hands, lost to both. For a moment, the two of them simply stood. The distance between fence and barn, no wider than a stone's throw, yet heavy with unspoken danger. She was a figure from the edge of his world, part mystery, part threat, part fragile promise. And though Thomas told himself to measure her as an enemy, something in the tilt of her gaze unsettled him. It was not fear, not hatred. It was something else, a recognition, as if she had known his name long before she spoke her own. The morning light climbed higher, spilling gold over timber and soil. But the ranch no longer felt like his alone. It belonged, in that instant, to the silence stretched taut between him and the warrior woman who had come to his fence. Thomas took one slow step forward, the bridle dangling at his side like a forgotten weight. The earth crunched under his boots. Loud in the silence, the woman's gaze never shifted. She might have been a hawk perched on a fence post, poised to strike or to flee, but not to waver. "You're on Rawlins' land," he said, finally, his voice low but steady. "You've got a reason, or you'd be gone already." Nayeli's lips parted. Not quite a smile, not quite defiance. "I come with words," she answered. The syllables touched with the cadence of her people. "The water that runs through this valley was promised to my tribe. Promises vanish when paper burns. We seek what was ours." Thomas felt a coldness settle behind his ribs. His father's dealings again, rising from the grave to haunt him. "And you come alone. At daybreak, to talk about promises." His tone sharpened. "That pouch on your side doesn't look like talk." Her hand closed reflexively around the leather. For a moment she seemed to struggle, as though weighing how much truth she could risk. Then she said nothing at all, letting the silence hang like a drawn bowstring. It was in that silence that the first shot rang out. A bullet cracked into the fence post 2 feet from Thomas's shoulder. Splinters flying. The horses in the barn screamed, hooves pounding against the stalls. Thomas dropped the bridle and dove behind the corner of the barn, instinct carrying him faster than thought. From the hillsides and gullies came the unmistakable rhythm of rifles being worked metal against metal, the hushed clicks of bolts drawn back, hammers cocked. Whoever they were close, hidden in the folds of the land, watching him like prey. Thomas cursed under his breath. He had known the ranch was too quiet this morning. The woman had not come alone. She was the bait, the lure, and he had stepped right into the snare. He risked a glance around the barn. Nayeli had not run. Instead, she moved into the open, her body angled between him and the hills, as though shielding him. Her voice carried, sharp and commanding, but not in English. The words cut the air like flint on steel. The gunman did not answer. Another shot cracked, this one burying itself in the dirt near Thomas's boot. Deliberate. A warning. Nayeli turned her head, her dark eyes catching his across the distance. "They are not my people," she said, louder now, her voice ringing with urgency. "They wear no paint, carry no songs. They serve Jasper Whitcomb." The name landed like iron in Thomas's chest. Witcom, the railroad baron, who had swallowed up half the valley and hungered for the rest. He was ruthless, and he did not forgive debts. If Whitcomb's men were here, then they were after something more than water rights. They wanted whatever secrets his father had left behind. Thomas felt the old fury stir. Tangled with grief, he thought, long buried. His father's death on a cold winter trail had never sat right with him. Too neat, too sudden. Now the pieces began to edge together. Another shot split the air. Closer this time. Nayeli reached into her pouch and drew a flash of steel, a small knife. Its blade honed, thin as moonlight. Without hesitation, she flung it toward the nearest muzzle flash in the scrub. A cry of pain followed, sharp and human. The distraction was enough. Thomas lunged toward the fallen rifle, scooping it from the dirt as its owner writhed unseen in the brush. He rolled to cover behind the corral fence, thumbed back the hammer, and fired. His shot cracked into the rocks, sending fragments flying. Nayeli was suddenly at his side, her breath quick, her shoulder brushing his. There was no room left for doubt. Whatever role she had been sent to play, she had chosen otherwise. "They circle the house," she whispered, her words clipped. "If we stay." "We de—" Thomas's jaw tightened. He could smell the dust rising. taste the bitterness of gunpowder. He had fought rustlers before, but this was no simple raid. This was war laid at his doorstep, with a woman he did not trust and yet could not abandon. Their eyes locked in that instant. No words, just a thread of recognition of need, of survival, of something fragile beginning in the heart of danger. Thomas felt his chest pound with more than fear. "Then we run," he said. Together. They broke for the barn, the gunfire chasing them like a storm. The barn swallowed them in darkness, heavy with the scent of hay, leather, and the warm musk of horses. Dust hung in the beams of light that pierced through knotholes in the wood. Outside, the rifles barked, their echoes rolling across the valley like thunder. But for one brief moment, inside these walls, time seemed to bend. Thomas Rawlins and Nayeli pressed close, breathing hard, their lives balanced on the edge of a bullet. Thomas braced his back against a stall door, forcing his lungs to slow. His hand tightened around the rifle he had snatched. The wood stock was slick with sweat, but it was loaded, and that meant a fighting chance. He cast a look at Nayeli. She crouched a few feet away, her knife still glinting in her palm, her chest rising and falling in fierce rhythm. She met his stare without flinching. "You could have left me," Thomas said, voice rough with disbelief. "You were not the enemy." She answered simply, as if no more explanation was needed. The words settled between them, quiet but sharp. Outside, the gunfire shifted, men calling to one another in harsh, hurried tones. The attackers were spreading wide, preparing to close in. Thomas's mind worked quickly. The barn could not hold them for long. "There's a creek out back," he muttered. "If we cut through the horses, slip out the rear." Nayeli shook her head. "They wait for that. Whitcomb's men always wait where fear would run." She dug into her pouch again, pulling free a small object that glimmered dully in the dim light. A key. She pressed it into his hand, in the ewe saddle hidden near the creek. "You'll find papers," she said, her voice low, urgent. "Proof against Whitcomb. Enough to bring his men to trial." Thomas stared at the key, its weight heavier than iron. His father's shadow loomed again, Edward Rawlins, who had whispered of secrets but never revealed them. The ranch had always felt like an inheritance soaked in unfinished battles. And now this woman, a stranger from a world he barely understood, held out a path that led deeper into that inheritance. "There's more," Thomas said slowly. His throat tightened. "My father left something behind. A journal. He wrote everything he couldn't say aloud. I've kept it locked away. Buried." Her eyes flickered. Curiosity mingled with something softer, respect. "Perhaps." Then together, she said. Another round of shots slammed into the barn wall, splinters raining down. The horses reared and screamed. Thomas grabbed Nayeli's arm. "We move," he said. They sprinted from stall to stall, dodging the slivers of daylight where bullets punched through. At the far end, Thomas shoved open a door. The hinges groaning in protest, they burst into the corral, dust exploding beneath their boots. Gunfire roared, dirt spraying at their feet. Thomas raised his rifle and fired, dropping one shadowed figure from a low ridge. Side by side they ran, lungs burning, until they reached the cellar doors half hidden behind the ranch house. Thomas wrenched them open, dragging Nayeli down into the cool darkness. The cellar smelled of earth and cedar. Wooden shelves sagged with jars of preserves, barrels of grain, and forgotten tools. In the corner, beneath a tarp, sat a trunk blackened with age. Thomas knelt, his hands trembling. He pried open the rusted lock with the butt of his rifle. Inside lay a journal bound in cracked leather. He lifted it reverently, brushing dust from the cover. The sight of his father's cramped handwriting on the first page made his chest ache. Nayeli leaned closer, her shoulder nearly touching his, her breath warm against his cheek as she read. Edward Rawlins had recorded names, dates, sums of money, payments from the railroad to judges, to marshals, to men in dark corners who had silenced witnesses, and at the margins, scrawled notes about fear, his own fear, that the truth would die with him. Thomas's throat burned. He knew. He whispered. He knew, and they killed him for it. Nayeli placed her hand lightly on his. Now you know, and so do I. For a long moment, they sat in silence. The chaos outside reduced to a dull roar. Thomas became aware of how close she was, of the steady calm she carried even after the storm of bullets. Her eyes met his, and in them he saw not only strength, but a grief that mirrored his own. He wanted to ask about her scars, about the weight she carried that made her seem older than her years, but words caught in his throat. Instead, he simply nodded. We stand together. She gave the smallest of smiles, fierce and fleeting, until the end. When they climbed back into the daylight, the gunfire had ebbed. Whitcomb's men were regrouping, circling for the final strike. But something between Thomas and Nayeli had shifted. They were no longer strangers bound by accident. They were allies bound by bloodshed and trust, however fragile. As they readied themselves for the next onslaught, Thomas felt a new rhythm beneath his ribs. It was not just the drumbeat of survival. It was the pulse of something he had not dared imagine in years. Hope, and beside it, something more dangerous, still desire. The world beyond their fence line was closing in. But for the first time since his father's death, Thomas did not feel alone. The lull did not last. By the time Thomas and Nayeli emerged from the cellar, the morning air had thickened with smoke and dust. The attackers had set a wagon alight near the corral, the fire crackling hungrily as sparks jumped from plank to plank. Horses screamed in terror, their eyes rolling white. Thomas shouldered his rifle, scanning the ridges. Shadows darted between rocks. Too many. He counted at least half a dozen muzzles glinting in the sun. Maybe more. They were tightening the noose, each man angling toward the house, where he and Nayeli now stood exposed. Nayeli pressed close to the barn wall, knife still in hand. Her cheeks glistened with sweat, her braid loose and tangled. Yet her posture was steady, her gaze fierce. Witcom is here, she whispered. Thomas's jaw clenched. The name carried more weight than the gunfire itself. Jasper Whitcomb, railroad baron, empire builder, man who had turned justice into currency, his father's greatest enemy, his ranch's shadow. A voice carried then, smooth and commanding. Thomas Rawlins. It echoed off the slopes, rich with mockery. I was beginning to think you'd forgotten me. Whitcomb stepped into view, flanked by two riflemen. He wore a black frock coat despite the heat, a gold chain glinting across his vest. His face was long, narrow, lined with disdain. In one hand, he carried a revolver, polished, bright as silver. In the other, he gripped Nayeli's arm. She had moved forward, drawing his fire, and now found herself in his grasp. Thomas's heart lurched. Let her go. Whitcomb's smile was thin. Your father owed me answers he never lived to give. Perhaps you inherited them. Papers, a ledger, a journal, whatever he called it. Hand it over, or I end this girl's bargaining days early. Nayeli did not flinch, even with cold steel pressed to her temple. Do not give him anything, she hissed, her voice carrying enough for Thomas to hear. Thomas raised his rifle, but Whitcomb yanked her tighter, the revolver digging cruelly into her skin. Behind him, his riflemen fanned out, their barrels aimed squarely at Thomas's chest. The weight of choice slammed into him. His father's journal burned heavy beneath his coat. The proof of corruption, blood, betrayal, all of it lay in his hands. One move could doom Nayeli. Another could doom the land his family had bled for. For a moment, the world narrowed to the sound of his own breathing. the hammering of his pulse. He saw his father's grave, raw in the frozen earth. He saw the years he had spent alone on this ranch, stone-faced, guarding memories like secrets. And now he saw Nayeli, her eyes unwavering, her body a shield for him earlier, her voice steady, even with death at her brow. Something inside him snapped. "You want the truth?" Whitcomb. His voice rose, fierce, raw. "It's written in every acre you've stolen, every grave you've filled. My father wrote it down. I'll carve it into your name myself if I have to." Whitcomb sneered, pressing harder against Nayeli. "Brave words. Empty, if you fall before the law ever hears them." But before he could tighten his grip, a new sound thundered across the valley, the drumming of hooves. From the tree line burst Dakota, Iron Hand, and 8 mounted warriors, their silhouettes dark against the rising sun. Spears gleamed, rifles glinted, feathers streamed in the wind. They rode in a crescent, cutting off Whitcomb's men, their war cries splitting the air like knives. Chaos erupted, gunfire cracked, horses whinnied, dust exploded beneath pounding hooves. Whitcomb cursed, dragging Nayeli backward as his riflemen faltered. One toppled from his perch, an arrow jutting from his shoulder. Another dropped his weapon, fleeing toward the ridge. Thomas seized the moment. He charged forward, firing once, twice, his shots forcing Whitcomb to stumble. Nayeli twisted in his grip, slamming her elbow into his ribs. The revolver wavered, fired harmlessly into the dirt. In a surge of fury, Thomas closed the distance and drove him to the ground, their bodies colliding with bone-jarring force. They grappled in the dust, Whitcomb snarling, Thomas's hands fueled by rage long starved. The journal, his father's death. The years of silence all poured into each strike. Whitcomb clawed, spat, tried to draw his revolver again. But Thomas pinned his arm and wrenched the gun free. Around them, Dakota's warriors finished the rout. Whitcomb's men scattered, those who resisted falling quickly to steal and lead. The fire near the corral died under a flood of kicked dirt and trampled earth. The ranch, though scarred, still stood. Thomas pressed the revolver to Whitcomb's chest, his breath ragged. He could end it now. He could silence the man who had poisoned his valley, destroyed his father, threatened the woman beside him. But Nayeli's voice cut through the haze. No. She knelt beside him, her hand firm on his shoulder. If he dies here, his lies remain. Let the truth carry him down. Thomas's chest heaved. Slowly, he lowered the gun. Dakota approached, his presence commanding. He stooped, lifted the journal Thomas held, and raised it high. This, Dakota declared, will speak louder than any bullet. Your father trusted us. We will carry it where Whitcomb's coin cannot reach. Whitcomb sagged in the dirt, defeated but alive, his empire shaken by ink and witness. Thomas rose, shoulders heavy, but for the first time in years, not alone. He turned to Nayeli. Their eyes met, exhaustion and relief colliding. In her gaze burned the fire of a warrior and the tenderness of something unspoken. For a heartbeat, the world faded, leaving only the two of them, bound by danger and choice. The battle was over. But the war was just beginning. Smoke drifted lazily across the ranch yard, a pale veil over shattered fences and trampled earth. The morning sun had climbed high enough to burn the dew from the grass, but the smell of gunpowder still lingered, sharp as iron. Horses stamped nervously in their stalls, unsettled by the echo of battle. Thomas sat on the porch steps, his rifle laid across his knees, the weight of exhaustion pulling at every muscle. He had fought rustlers before, storms, fire, hunger, but nothing had cut this deep. Nothing had pulled the truth of his father's past into daylight so mercilessly. Nayeli approached slowly, her braid unraveling, dust streaking her tunic, blood Someone else's smudged across her sleeve. She lowered herself onto the step beside him. Not close enough to touch, but close enough that he felt her presence steadying him like a brace. For a long moment, they said nothing. Silence, after so much noise, was a balm neither wanted to break. At last, Nayeli spoke. Your father trusted Dakota. He gave him the journal when he feared death would come. He wanted the truth to live beyond him. Thomas let the words sink in, heavy and hollow. He swallowed. He died alone. I thought maybe he carried his secrets to the grave because he didn't trust me. His voice cracked. Raw. Now I see he was protecting me. Protecting this place. Nayeli's eyes softened. The steel of a warrior tempered by understanding. He protected you, so that today, you could choose. And you chose not to let anger decide for you. Thomas turned his head, meeting her gaze. If it had been you, his throat tightened. If Witcom had pulled that trigger, you would have thrown away your father's truth to save me. Her tone was not accusation, but quiet fact. And I would have done the same for you. The admission hung between them, fragile and fierce. Thomas exhaled, a breath that seemed to empty years of loneliness from his chest. He reached out, almost hesitant, and brushed a strand of hair from her cheek. Dust clung to it, but beneath, her skin glowed warm, alive. I don't know what comes next, he murmured. But I know this much, I can't go back to the way it was. Not after today. Nayeli lowered her eyes for a heartbeat, then raised them again. Steady. The path ahead will not be kind. My people will look at you and see only a white man, the son of a rancher. Your people will look at me and see only the enemy. Every step will be a fight. Thomas gave a small, weary smile. I've been fighting my whole life. Maybe it's time I fight for something worth keeping. Her lips curved, just enough to soften the sharp lines of her face. Then we fight together. A quiet fell again. But it was no longer heavy. It was alive, carrying the thrum of something new between them. The sound of hoofbeats drifted from the distance, Dakota and his warriors departing, carrying the journal east toward the offices of men who might yet uphold justice. For now, the ranch was still. Thomas set the rifle aside and took Nayeli's hand in his faith. Rough palm against calloused fingers. Neither spoke, because there was no need. The morning, scarred though it was, had given them a truth greater than any paper or ledger that life, even hemmed in by prejudice and danger, was more bearable when shared. Above them, the sky stretched wide and blue, a reminder that the world could wound and heal in the same breath. And for the first time in years, Thomas Rawlins felt the stirrings of peace, not the peace of solitude, but of finding another heart beating in rhythm with his own. By late afternoon, the ranch had quieted. The fires were out, the last of Whitcomb's men driven off into the hills. The land bore its scars, splintered rails, scorched timbers, patches of earth torn by hooves and bullets, but it still stood, defiant as the mountains beyond. Thomas and Nayeli walked the fence line together. The silence between them was no longer heavy with suspicion. It was companionable, steady, a thread binding two lives that only hours before had been strangers. Each step brought them past reminders of the morning's violence, yet also past the stubborn signs of endurance, cattle grazing again, a foal nosing its mother, the steady shimmer of the creek winding on as if untouched by men's quarrels. At the eastern fence, the place where it had all begun, Thomas stopped. The post that had taken the first bullet leaned crooked, a scar of splintered wood marking its defiance. He touched it lightly, then glanced at Nayeli. This fence should have kept us apart, he said. Instead, it brought us face to face. Nayeli laid her hand beside his, her fingers resting over the crack. Wood breaks, promises fade. But what we choose now, it can last, if we guard it. For a long moment they stood there, framed by the sweep of the Sangre de Cristo peaks. The sky awash with the golden fire of sunset. Thomas turned toward her, and she did not look away. In her gaze he saw both the fierce pride of her people and the quiet flame that had sparked between them. He bent closer, brushed his lips against hers, soft, brief, a promise rather than a conquest. The world seemed to hush, the evening breeze carrying only the sound of the creek, whispering through stone. When they drew apart, Thomas looked out across the valley, its scars glowing in the last light. "This land will bear many battles yet," he murmured, "but it will also bear us." Nayeli squeezed his hand. "Then let it remember more than war. Let it remember love." And as the sun dipped behind the ridges, the fence that had once marked a boundary stood instead as a monument, a place where mistrust had given way to trust. And two hearts, divided by blood and history, had chosen to meet. If this story moved you, don't let it end here. Like, share, and subscribe to keep these untold tales of the Wild West alive, stories where love and courage cross boundaries of blood, land, and history. Each story we bring is a reminder that beneath the dust and danger were hearts that dared to hope. By supporting this channel, you help preserve the human side of frontier life, the struggles, the tenderness, the choices that still echo today. Join us, and let's ride further into the West together.